Well, the title is in fact from the original project application. As you'll see, it's become a somewhat broader and still exploratory topic. Some of the analysis is still to be done. The Keynes Fund support, which obviously we're all very grateful for, I'm very grateful for, was piggybacking on a series of other supports, mainly from ESRC, which allowed another important part of the data to be got out, as I'll explain in a moment. The actual Keynes support supported the three co-authors I've listed at the bottom, but they've all moved on to greater things in other universities, so they're not with me today. Now, the framework that I want to look at is interesting because, the data that we're using is from 1861 to 1881. And it's on local profits of individual businesses. There's individual level data at the business level, and individual employment levels, workforce levels of the firms of these businesses. And this period coincides very nicely with the early writings by Marshall and his wife, Mary Paley Marshall. And of course, the subsequent development that Marshall put through his various editions of principles and other things. So it's quite a nice opportunity, this data, to look at how we can understand the world that Marshall himself was looking at, and obviously how correct he was, but also perhaps give a little bit more insight into why Marshall developed the views he did, looking at the world he had at that particular time. I think everyone who's looked at Marshall's viewed him as being very empirically driven, as well as developing the theoretical side of economics in so many important directions. He argued that the profits of individual firms came from their relative competitive position in local and wider markets, but they're very strongly driven by industry means, the equilibrium view. There'll be a lot of individual deviations by particular firms, and individual firms might change significantly within the composition of the mean over time, but the mean rates would stay, would tend to converge to a common level. So does that occur in the data that we see? Another feature, and this was part of the monopoly-monopsony argument of the original project, is can we investigate through the data we have here some of the sources of barriers to entry and development of equilibrium amongst wider groups of firms. And one of the key elements of this might be the development of the rail network. Now, it has to be said that rail by 1861, which is the date of the start of the period being examined, had pretty well covered most of England and quite a lot of Wales. The data is restricted to England and Wales, we'll see. So that the gaps that were remaining were relatively small. Nevertheless, full market integration is not really being achieved until well into the 20th century, as Crafts and others have argued. So there should be potential to examine how far the developing rail network from the 1860s on was important to breaking down barriers, or lack of access still provided barriers. But we can also look at some other wider issues with the data in terms of particularly the locational gaps and different sector barriers, particularly as we'll see the professions come out of this very strongly as an area with high profitability. So the sector differences we can examine are what I'm calling 1-digit and 5-digit levels to coincide with the modern SICs, but as you'll see, the sectors have to be adapted in definitions to fit the historical data. Now we're dealing with small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, here. The data don't contain anything very large, and therefore we're looking at an area of business activity that's on relatively local scale in many cases, though some of these are national companies, nationally well known at the time, some still in existence, but they're generally small, and we would expect the existence of any monopolies or other barriers to be in the more distant, remoter markets, and perhaps to affect the smaller firms more than the larger firms. Now, the data we have come from two different sources. And one, it derives from the other funding, the SRC project. And this has allowed, as a large-scale enterprise that's now finished, constructed what we call the British Business Census of Entrepreneurs. BBC has a website there that gives you an atlas of this for the 19th century up to 1911. And it derives from the encoded records of the electronic censuses for the whole of that period. Now, what we're actually dealing with here is England and Wales only. They're essentially non-corporate businesses and they're non-farm. So the farmers are out of this, but other bits of agriculture are in. It uses a census question that existed only for the period 1851 to 81. And we originally in the project proposed using 1851, but we had to narrow it to 1861 to 81 because of the complexities of dealing with the tax and profit definitions for the early year. That's still an ambition to integrate, but there are big issues with that. So it's been left for the moment. So we're dealing with 3 census years, 3 decades of development. The question actually used in the census is in there in the box. It's not a very well-designed question by modern standards. It leads to a lot of problems in responses, but it worked in the sense that it gives employee data on a very large number of firms, about 200,000 firms per census, and it also allows the identification of a lot of self-employed people who had no employees, what were called own account proprietors at the time. They actually have to be found. This is not in the census records. They had to be found as a major part of the SRC project by searching the 60 million census records for that period by algorithm and clerical checks. So that's one part of the data. The Keynes Fund project was used to develop the other part of the data, which is from the profits declared to the tax authorities, the revenue at the time, called Schedule D profits for non-farmers. Farmers were also taxed, but we haven't looked at their records. Now, these were private individual documents. They were not supposed to survive. They were supposed to be destroyed, but there are actually quite a number of them scattered around local record offices dealing with the records of businesses in those localities and in odds and ends at the National Archives at Kew. We collected those as part of the SRC project, but the Keynes Fund money has been used to link these to the actual census respondents. Now, it's key here that we're dealing with the entrepreneur themselves in this, the individual proprietors of the company, so we can find them in the census records as employers. We have their employment records and we have their profit records. We've got to link the two. That is actually a very time-consuming project, and that's where most of the Keynes money went, unfortunately, is into record linkage. There are about 10,000 individual records we found for this period. There were more in 1851, which have been left for the moment, but actually the linkage rate is relatively low. We found just under 3,000 records. There are issues about representativeness there, but in fact, the dropout rate of non-unlinked isn't a particular problem. More of an issue is the fact that the records are very complete. They give essentially all the taxable businesses in 18 localities. Some of which are big enough, 11 of which are big enough to look at those as a local, at a local level, and then a whole series of scattered records from around the country. It has to be estimated, as we'll see, through a pooled time series section, because the localities aren't repeated or are only occasionally repeated over time, and the individuals are only occasionally repeated over time. So we haven't been able to use any panel work, fixed effects work, or what we originally hoped would be a difference in difference estimation, which would have allowed perhaps some interesting things about railways. But if we can bring the 1851 data in the future, I think there will be a small amount of potential to develop that further. So all the estimation is pooled time series costed at the spatial level, England and Wales aggregates, and we tested the representativeness of the distribution we have, which fits the England and Wales aggregate data reasonably well for the smaller businesses, but it has a spatial pattern which is not ideal. The 18 localities are named there where we have full data, that is all taxed businesses in those areas. Some are very small, some are big. Brighton's the 15th largest urban area in the country at the time. Westminster is part of London. It's a large part of London, a very big focus of businesses at the time. Idle is a part of Bradford. The rest of the areas, however, are well represented. This gives you an idea of the urban areas in the brick colour here, which are well represented in the scattered data. So all the big urban centres are well represented, as well as a lot of remote urban places. And in our sample, the remotest places are parts of Hereford, parts of Wiltshire, which are surprisingly remote from the rail network at this time, and some pieces of Lincolnshire over here that didn't get railways until the 1870s. Candleshoe covers Skegness, the resort of Skegness on the east coast. Faversham and Devizes are at about 10,000 population at this time. So it's actually not a bad, but it has various spatial issues that have to be handled. The actual profits data, simplistically described here, give you the mean profits, the mean employment level, and the profitability, which we're measuring, because we don't have capital values, capital investment assets or anything else. We only have employment and profits of these businesses in those cases. So it's profit per worker look like this. So as you can see, high profitability is associated with some of the industries you might expect, manufacturing and mining, but is also high in professional services, which means things like solicitors, and also in things like agricultural processing, which was milling and so on. But the actual profitability levels are very high amongst the professions, and they're actually rather low as a profit per worker, in issues of productivity here, of course, and in construction and manufacturing and so on. And so at our aggregate level, it's perhaps important to just note here that the maker-dealer category isn't an SIC issue, but within census terminology and the sort of businesses we had, they're a significant part of the data. These are shoemakers who are also selling them. This is a maker-dealer category. And if we remember Marshall, actually, there's a lot of discussion about these as the traditional craftsmen, as he called it, who are making their products and selling them in every village and town. Tailors, shoemakers, blacksmiths, and so on. If we break it down at the most frequent 19 categories that appear in the data at what we call a quasi 5-digit SIC level, as you can see, the most frequent are inns and publicans and hotels. Quite a large part of the data, they're 10% of the data. There were an awful lot of them, and they were taxed because they couldn't really escape, because they also had to be licensed in those cases. They couldn't escape scrutiny. However, going down the list, they're all in the in terms of tax businesses with profits data are tending to be retail or closely focused businesses within town commercial environments. You can see that the highest profitabilities are actually for doctors and lawyers because they employ a relatively small workforce, about 2 to 3 people. They're mainly partnerships. They don't have other staff at this time. And so this is actually, I think, quite an interesting finding. If you wanted to make a reasonably good income at this time, the professions were very attractive. You had to work jolly hard to do it as a manufacturer, as a miner, or whatever. Now, what do the data show us? Very quick results here. An analysis of variance is quite interesting to bring out the differences in the degree to which you can explain the variability of the data by locational or sectoral factors. So profit levels, which is this slide, is essentially very locationally specific. Profits account for far more of the variance, locations account for far more of the variance than sector effects do. This is the 1 digits, but the 5 digits show similar effect, although much more complex. However, there's a huge residual here. There's an awful lot of variability not explained, which comes back to entrepreneurial personality or agency. Now, if we look at this in more detail, taking a regression estimate of these data with the various controls and various other factors listed here, you can see that the different sectors jump out in the way that the raw data showed you, but the interesting spatial effects are that the 5 spatial categories we have, urban areas in general are the base. London gets a higher profit level than, yes, I'll start to bring it into a close in a moment. Rural is, however, below the urban base. Access to rail is important. It puts up profit levels. Access to waterways marginally. Portfolios, complex businesses with several activities, reduce it actually, showing that portfolios are often a survival strategy and the partnership size of the business increases. We look at profit rates, so profit per worker. However, the reverse patterns are true. Sectors are far more important than locations in an analysis of variance. The residual is proportionately somewhat reduced to have a better level of explanation. Spatial factors now drop out of significance altogether, and we're back to, except for an urban classificatory structure, and sector factors are similar to the previous. What does all this mean? It means that variability is a key factor. There's a very large residual. Marshall thought that individual personality was important. Individual firms could vary a lot, although the reversion to the mean was very important. For profitability, profit per worker, the variation at local level is generally more limited than sectors, and other locational effects are relatively more muted, except for the rural and London comparisons with urban. There is, in other words, an increasing indication of market integration, but the rates per industry sector seem to be what Marshall was suggesting to hold, seem to be held up in the data. Of course, Marshall didn't have these data, although he knew about it by his travels around. Monopolies and other barriers, in other words, through access to transport and through the professions were important, really, only at a relatively minor level for access, but for professions were important. As we go back, the professions are jumping out here, either at the personal professions or the business-focused profession as key elements. For profit levels, the converse is true, as we've just seen, and it's more complicated with partner and portfolio effects. Demography, I didn't have a chance to comment on earlier, but you'll see that age didn't come out, and we tested a lot of other demographic effects, and demography of the individual entrepreneur do not come out. So this leaves personality as the residual in this, as well as other specifics of the business itself. Now, I think this is quite important because it extends Marshall's analysis to the rather smaller end of the spectrum. Under £30,000 profit levels is the maximum we have, which is equivalent on the Bank of England comparator to about 3.5 million of profit. Let's take home profit today. Now, this can be enlarged a lot through case studies. I had the ambition that we might be able to look at Marshallian districts at one point, but you'll see the sample here is not terribly good for district analysis unless you take a very broad range of districts. However, there's something that can be said on that. But there's a lot can be said about the case studies in other ways. There are issues about whether all this could be aggregated up for small businesses, clearly not for large ones, and that something useful could be said about this as a macroeconomic effect on profits over time and the factors behind it. And the data deposit will allow others to work on it, and that's been a very key output, I think, for the future of the Keynes support. Thank you.